We're finishing off chapter 1 today, here in the book of Romans. The last lesson we covered verses 18 through 23. The operative sentence, of course, being verse 18, which is thematically continuing on in our passage here today. Verse 18 of Romans chapter 1, reading, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." This he continues to extrapolate upon in our passage, which specifically is verses 24 to 32, to the ending of the chapter. Okay, continuing to work our way through the opening foundation of Paul's work here in the extrapolation upon the human condition, the state of mankind, our nature, our enslavement to sin, and what specifically, at least not exclusively, but particularly in this kind of passage, preeminent perhaps in the New Testament and really the whole of Scripture, the Christian doctrine of what we call total depravity. Okay, and we'll explain that as we work our way through what's meant by that in historic Christian terms. So let's read the passage, pray, and then go from there. All right? So, Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 32. "Therefore, God gave them over in their lusts of their heart, in the lust of their heart, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their females exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also, the males abandoned the natural function of the female and burned in their desire toward one another, males with males, committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their own error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to an unfit mind to do those things which are not proper, having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, violent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, and disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the righteous requirement of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them." Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Alrighty, a lot going on there. Let's work our way through, of course, obviously from verse 24. I mentioned in the introduction that verse 18, the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. This is the extrapolation upon that very defining thesis statement, as it were, so to speak. We have multiple descriptions that are being given. We have lengthy lists, albeit not exhaustive, of course, that are given, particularly in the latter half of the passage that we have before us today. But there is notable structure here, and I'm going to do my best to highlight that as we work our way through. And they are centered particularly upon three repetitions of the same phrase: God gave them over. Okay, your translation might say God handed them over or God delivered them over. It's all much the same in English. Okay, but the same operative phrase of God gave them over. We see that 3 times in verses, fortunately for us, very neatly, verses 24, 26, and 28. Okay, so even if you cast your eyes there, I won't go through the whole thing yet, but verse 24, "Therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, etc. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions, etc. And then verse 28, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to an unfit mind, etc. Okay? So this portion is structured around three explications and explanations of this action of God. Okay, and we'll explain the context, which will become more apparent as we work our way through. But that's the broad structure of how this kind of subdivides structurally within this portion at the end of chapter 1. Right? And obviously, as we saw, verse 24, it begins with the following: therefore, God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Yeah? God gave them over to, in this case, the first of them, the lust of their hearts in impurity. So that's that which way they desired to do, right? Obviously, much akin to the rest of this passage, lust is having a very literal sense in terms of adultery and sexual degeneracy, but there is a general, more broad sense in which lust is at times used to refer to all desires, right? The lust for power, we might say in English, for example, okay, or the lust for money, so on. Right, it means unnaturally and sinfully and wickedly desirous of something. Okay, in this case, the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Right, so they've been given over by God to impurity. Okay, to degeneracy, to that which inherently corrupts and corrodes not just the body, which is going to become pertinent here, but also the soul. Okay. First order of business is explaining this. Threefold phrase which we have repeated: God gave them over. Okay, there are English translations that will say handed over, right? Because it is probably more literally what's being said: to give over or to hand over, to deliver over. Okay, this word gets used routinely in ancient Greek to describe, for example, the handing over of hostages in warfare, for example. Okay, or the capture of a wanted criminal. And handing him over to the courts. Okay, our Lord is even described in this terminology of being delivered over, right, to the authorities, if that makes sense. Okay, so it is a giving up of something. It's a relinquishing, right, or a releasing of control from one thing to another thing. Okay, could be persons. It could be, in this case, it's something deeper and theological and metaphysical, right? In the lust of their hearts to impurity. It's God giving man over to impurity. Okay? And the action here is of release, naturally in the term of handing over, that is deeply informative to how we're to kind of analyze and interpret and understand what's being said here. Okay? In more general terms, if we were trying to connect in multitudes of other texts, in Christian theological terms, we refer to one of the actions of God as the common grace of God. Okay, there are different ways in which God is gracious toward us. There is a particular and specific way in which God is gracious toward Christians in a different way than He is to non-Christians, in terms of salvation, of course, obviously, as well as the follow-on effects or the fruits, the byproducts of that salvation. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. But there is a sense, a general sense, ergo common grace, in which God is commonly gracious toward all of creation. Okay, the most wicked of men and women roaming the earth today stood upright and took a breath. Okay, they have food on their table, they have a roof over their head, right? In general terms. Okay, so on and so forth. Their life is not yet ended. Right, the very life which is in God's hands, for it is the Lord that gives and the Lord that takes away, including life itself. Right? In this particular instance, we refer to that as the common grace of God. Okay, God is commonly gracious toward all, which itself ends up becoming, much in respect to the kind of general thrust of this portion of Romans 1, a judgment in and of itself, because each day that a man goes on in rebellion against God is still another day that he has breath in his lungs because of God. Does that make sense? Right? Which is why, of course, again, verse 18, this operative thesis statement of this whole portion, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right? God's wrath is not only reserved for the great day of judgment, it is also manifest in time, in history, in this world, okay? The fact that one rebels against God, that one continues to be enslaved to the lust of their own heart and impurity, to use the phrase we have before us in verse 24, and the other ones, despite all that God has given us, is itself a form of metaphysical judgment. Okay? God continues to give you life. He continues to provide for you. Everything that you have and know and love, you would not have if God had not willed it, and yet you continue to rebel against him. Okay? The judgment is implicit, right? That's what's essentially being referred to in terms of common grace. Now, part of that common grace is the restraining of evil in the general sense, okay? No matter how rampant we perceive evil to be at various different points in history, some greater, some lesser, the reality is from the totality of Scripture that God is described as restraining evil. Okay, he's described as having guardianship over the nations. He's described as holding the hearts of kings in his hand, right? A direct reference to his sovereignty, of course. He is described as allotting the times and boundaries of nations and of peoples, so on and so forth, right? All these kinds of references, direct and indirect, that we get Old and New Testament, okay? And the restraining of evil is something that is part of that, okay? It's why we see climactic times in which that restraining hand, so to speak, anthropomorphically, is removed, as much as in the days of the antediluvian world, okay, the days of Noah, right? And that's where we get this massive kind of hyperbolic language of the thoughts and actions, of paraphrasing, but the thoughts and actions of all mankind were continuously evil, right? What's being said there is that any restraint on evil, not only on the part of man, but from God, is gone at that point. It's a free-for-all, okay? Sodom and Gomorrah had become a free-for-all, ergo it's righteous judgment, right? This and that and so on and so forth, right? There's various different times in which the Scriptures speak of this. The work of the Spirit, as in the Holy Spirit, in restraining evil is one of the key functions of the Holy Spirit, amongst many other things, okay? It applies at the individual level, it applies at macroscopic levels of nations and kingdoms and empires, entire people groups, right? At all ends of that spectrum, the Holy Spirit restrains evil. And when he removes that restraint, when he removes that proverbial hand of restraint, this is what is being described as being handed over to, okay? God, or giving them over, same thing, right? Delivering over, all these terms that we have in English, right? Translating the same fundamental word, right? To give over, to deliver, to give up, so on and so forth, okay? We should not understand this phrase to mean that the people who are the purview of this passage would otherwise have done good things and somehow God then made them do bad things. That would be to completely tear the words up, right? The giving up or the handing over to, the delivering over to, gives you a bit of a sense, even just in those English words, of the kind of active and passive actions that are going on here, right? To give over to something, to give someone up to something, right? In this particular case, the lust of their hearts to impurity, is by virtue of the fact implicitly in the words that the desires, i.e. the lusts of the hearts of those people, was toward impurity, and God therefore gives them up to it. He stops restraining evil. He simply hands them over to that which they were desirous of, ergo the term lust is being used there, right? You see that again, that same concept akin in verse 26, just to even briefly jump forward. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, right? So passions, right? Desires, wills, wants, right? Things which are desirous, okay? There's this action that's inherent in the actual people themselves, okay? As a result of sin. And so God giving them up to that is the removal of that common grace. It's the removal of any restraint on the part of the Holy Spirit, okay? And we do see this referenced many, many times, right? One such example would be, and again, we reference a lot of them, but at least if I can connect two that have some direct connection to themselves, to each other respectively, Psalm 81 verses 11 and 12 says, God speaking about the evil of and his disappointment in the ancient Israelites. Verse 11 and 12 of Psalm 81, quote, but God speaking, but my people did not listen to my voice, and Israel was not willing to obey me. So I gave them over to the stubbornness of their heart, that they would walk in their own devices. Okay? So the dynamic's fairly self-evident from that kind of passage, right? The stubbornness of their own hearts, right? The obstinate refusal to listen, the continual unrepentant state of sin, right, and evil and malice and so on and so forth, that refused to actually bend and bow, right? And so God gave them over to the stubbornness of their own hearts, that they would walk in their own devices. In other words, to reap the consequences of their own thoughts and actions, right? It's something that even St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, the first martyr of the church, explicitly accuses in his days, the Judeans of, right, the Jewish people of, in Acts chapter 7. Probably easy to turn there because it's a bit of a longer passage. So go back one book to Acts and go to Acts chapter 7. The entire Acts chapter 7 is all about the martyrdom of St. Stephen. Brutally betrayed by his own people, his own kinsfolk, and was murdered. Right? And the chapter gives a lengthy account of his righteous and fiery and scathing final speech, defense of Christ, defense of himself, defense of the church, so on and so forth, right? But anyway, picking up in verse 39 of Acts chapter 7. It's Acts chapter 7, verse 39. Stephen speaking, of course, quote, our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to him, referring to God, but rejected him in their hearts, turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, quote, make for us gods who will go before us, for this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him, right? So he's referring to the infamous betrayal and the event of the golden calf back in Exodus, okay? Verse 41, at that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven. The host of heaven referring to the celestial bodies, the gods, okay? So delivered them up, same exact phrase we have, right, in our passage, to deliver over, to hand over, to give over, same thing, right? So here, Stephen is saying that God delivered them over to that, right? God removed any restraint. God essentially said, you're going to go this direction? Fine, do it, right? That's a more colloquial modern way of saying it. As it is written, continuing verse 42, as it is written in the book of the prophets, quote, did you present me with slain beasts and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, the images which you made to worship. I also will move you beyond Babylon. Right, so now he's tying another portion of later events in regards to the judgment that was brought upon them at the hands of Babylon. He's referring to the tabernacle of Moloch, the fact that the Israelites made child sacrifice to Moloch, that they worshipped Remphan, which is another Babylonian and Canaanite deity. The star in reference here, tragically and fascinatingly enough, is linked to the modern six-pointed star. That's where that star ultimately comes from. Right? It is associated with modern Judaism. Right? The star of Remphan. Okay. So, the star of it's called the Star of David by them. It doesn't have anything to do with, there's no biblical or archaeological connection to David. It comes from medieval Kabbalah, kind of so Jewish mysticism. But the star itself is linked to the same image of the star of Remphan, which was a six-pointed star. By the by, God here is described as delivering over the people to, in this case, idolatry. Okay, So it's not, and you can see from these kind of two passages, right? It's not simply like the Israelites were wanting to be faithful, if we're talking about, say, the golden calf. But then God kind of zapped them with some hocus pocus, and then all of a sudden they started worshipping the Egyptian gods. Do you know what I mean? Right? That there's nothing in Scripture that describes it that way, and no Christians have ever believed it to be that way. It would be a straw man argument to kind of think of it that way, right? It would be a false understanding, right? What is being said is that in the lusts of our heart, in our evil desires, in the enslavement of our will to sin, we desire to do X, Y, Z, right? God is actively restraining that. He's not actively causing it, but actively restraining. So opposite direction, okay? But through obstinance, or to use the phraseology of Psalm 81, the stubbornness of their heart, right? So stubbornness is implying this has been going on for more than 5 minutes, okay? It's not a momentary issue, right? It's something that's obstinate and ongoing, right? Ergo stubbornness. Eventually it reaches a point where God's restraining, God's compassion, God's mercy reaches its limit, and enough is enough. And he removes his active restraint, right? So it's not an active cause. So God's not the author of evil. God does not actively cause it in the metaphysical sense. Man causes it through his agency, right? But God, in his compassion, actually actively restrains. What he does is, through this terminology, removes his active restraint. So it's like opening the floodgates, so to speak, okay? That's what then occurs, handing them over to the thing that they desire to do in the first place, right? Later on in this book, in chapter 9, we're going to encounter this exact same language again, right, about God hardening the heart of Pharaoh, right? We'll cover that when we get to that in chapter 9 particularly, right? This is what's being described, okay? God gave them over. He removes his active restraint. He no longer restrains evil, as we see him do at various points throughout Scripture. His patience and long-suffering reaches its inevitable end, right? And there are other countless references to that as well. Examples of this would be the Philistines. Examples of this would even be Sodom and Gomorrah, which were given centuries to turn back from their evil and did not. The Israelites themselves, right, in terms of the judgment of Babylon, a judgment that brought about by Babylon, centuries and centuries and centuries. Like we even partly referenced that yesterday when looking at the great reformer, the King Josiah, right, where the Passover had not been celebrated properly until his day, right? So it's implying centuries of not doing it properly, if doing it at all in many cases by that point, right? So on and so forth, okay? And the cup of their wrath was now full, to use the phraseology, this kind of poetic language from the Old Testament, right? So verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, okay? This is why that phrase of verse 18 about the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness is a now and then thing, right? It's not just the great day of judgment, it's also in this life, right? Because it's not just merely a later spiritual state of affairs. He's describing here that their bodies would be dishonored among them, right? So there's real material, physical consequences in the here and now, okay? For they exchanged the truth of God for the lie, right? This is continuing now verse 25 of Romans chapter 1, okay? So Romans chapter 1, verse 25. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie, okay? And did something that we actually covered in our last lesson, especially in verse 23, right, which is where we left off. And they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Okay, so the exchange of the one true God, the exchange of the worship of the Creator for the creation. And we went all through the different ways in which that occurs, either in manufactured deities, in demon worship, so on and so forth. That's actually referenced from Acts 7 with Stephen, right? The worship of the hosts of heaven, the gods, okay, which are associated with the stars and the planets. That's why the planets are named after Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Neptune, etc. Or even the machinations of man, the systems of man, so ideologies, right? Modern Enlightenment ideologies being a classic example of that. Cults and religions created by man, right? So on and so forth. You get the picture. serving the creature rather than the creator, which is exactly what the distinction between false and true religion is. True religion worships the creator, God. False religion worships anything other or additional to the creator. Okay? Who is blessed forever, amen, a brief doxology. Right? So that's what the exchanging of the truth and the lie is. The truth, the worship of the creator; the lie, the worship and service of the creation. Right? Verse 26, for this reason, right, God gave them over to dishonourable passions. So again, you've got to follow it through kind of Socratically. Because mankind has exchanged the truth for a lie, right, the ultimate lie, because we have followed the lusts of our hearts in impurity, so impure worship, okay, worshipping the creation in this case, God has therefore also given mankind over to dishonourable passions. So what he's doing here is linking two things that are very important and going to inform the rest of what we have today. False worship, and again this might seem self-evident, but it gets quite complex. False worship produces evil. Ta-da. Right? In this case, the lusts of the heart in impurity, i.e. the worship of the creation, the lie, what it does is that the natural consequence of it is not just merely in the abstract kind of ideological sense, right? It's not like people believe the lie and worship and serve the creation, even if that creation is just themselves through modern atheism or agnosticism, and at the same time live righteous, pure, pietistic lives. This is shooting a cannonball through that concept. Okay, that's not what the case is. What he is saying, which is manifestly evident throughout human history, is that in exchanging the worship of God for the worship of anything other than God, it leads to corruption, decadence, decay, moral degradation, so on and so forth, to the likes of which are about to be explained throughout the rest of the passage. You following? Cool. Okay. Ergo, dishonourable passions. So dishonourable desires. Okay? And then he lists two main examples that then feed into the rest of the examples. For their females exchange the natural function for that which is unnatural. Right? So he's referring to lesbianism. And the same way also the males abandon the natural affection of the female and burned in their desire toward one another, males with males committing indecent acts, ergo sodomy. Okay? So homosexuality in either direction. Okay? Why is that the case? And there's something that's actually quite deeply philosophical about this. Where do I begin? So, the reason why, and it's not exclusively this, because there are other things that are on this level, right? And there are even things that do surpass this ultimately. Such as, for example, the direct worship of Satan, unironically. Okay? The reason why homosexuality, male to male, female to female, either direction, is so pernicious, so evil, so wicked, and so, to use the term here, unnatural. So literally, anti-natural, against the natural order, is because in its deepest philosophical sense, it is the ultimate expression of self-worship. Okay? What do I mean by that, and more importantly, how is that the case? When I say self-worship, what I'm referring to is the exact kind of exchange that's being referred to in the end of verse, 25, right? Worshipping and serving the creature rather than the creator, okay? Which is the ultimate, which is the lie that's in view, okay? The ultimate lie. Because fundamentally, at a metaphysical level in the dynamic of man and man, woman and woman in this particular sexual context, it is the sexualization, the sexual service of the exact same image that you are. Man and man, woman and woman, okay? It is, to use a technical term, autophiliac in nature, right? It is a form of autophilia, auto meaning self, okay? Philios or philia meaning love, right? It is exchanging the natural complementarity and difference between men and women, or in this case, a man and a woman, right? which obviously share a likeness, being human, but also are distinct in their likeness. Duh. We have difficulty computing that these days with issues of transgenderism, but that's a whole other subject. To exchange that natural differentiation for replication, man and man, woman and woman, is to serve and to worship and to venerate in the sexual context the exact same thing that you are. Okay? At a philosophical level, that's the dynamic that's taking place there. Right? It is why it is so egregiously and overtly unnatural. Right? It's also partly why, well, it's not just partly, it's even a big reason why. It's a big reason why even the most sexually licentious of pagans cultures throughout history, to one degree or another, viewed being the receiving partner in that relationship in either direction as the most shameful thing that a human being could ever do. Right? A low-born, thieving, homeless, criminal scum was not as bad as the receiving party of the relationship. Okay? It's why, for example, Julius Caesar's enemies at one point, right, back in the 1st century BC, right, the end of the Roman Republic, accused him of having a secret, lurid affair with a man and that he was the receiving party, right? Because it's the worst thing that his enemies could accuse him of. Do you understand? It wasn't true, but it was just complete rumour, right? And slander and gossip, to use the wording of ending of verse 29. But nonetheless, that's making the point of what I'm trying to say, right? The worst thing that they could accuse a Roman general of doing is being the receiving party in a sodomite relationship. Okay, even in dynamics and scenarios like with the Romans, speaking of the Romans, where they had civic monogamy, so marriage was only between one man and one woman. Right? There's no concept of polygamy in Rome. A man could have many mistresses, and often sometimes did, at least among the patrician class. Right? But the one thing that was the single greatest shame for any Roman man to ever be is that, the receiving party. Right? This, I'm saying to you, even among pagans, was held with the greatest level of scorn and shame for this metaphysical reason. Okay? Because ultimately, it is the loving of the self, because it's a replication of the same image, man and man, woman and woman. Okay? Many Christian theologians have written about this subject throughout history, if they've ever actually addressed it on the philosophical level. Right? The fundamental problem, among many others, with what we euphemistically call homosexuality today, right, is that it is autophilic in nature. It is a form of autophilia, self-love. Okay? It is the ultimate service of the self by loving and sexualizing the exact same image, man to man, woman to woman. Okay? That's why this is being described in this particular sense as exchanging the natural function for the unnatural, right? So it's not even being described simply as evil or wicked, although the rest of the passage obviously does that, right? The wickedness and the evil implies violation of God's law, right? The 10 Commandments, adultery, blah, blah, like these kinds of things, right? The commands against adultery, against all these kinds of things, right? Sexual licentiousness and so on and so forth, blah, blah. That's not just presumed, but even more directly stated later on in this ending point in the chapter. But at its root, it's first described here as unnatural. It is against the natural order. God has designed the world to work a particular way. It is the lex naturalis, the natural law, or the natural order, right? How has God created the world and designed it to work normally and properly? Here's how. When man goes against that, in rebellion against God and nature's God, it corrupts that nature, not only the nature of the person, but the nature of that which they are impacting upon, and things therefore get worse. Okay? It is a natural consequence, pardon the pun, of these things, right? Abandoning the natural function And what is the end result? Well, it's exactly what I'm referring to. So the ending of verse 27, receiving in their own persons, so literally in themselves, their own bodies, the due penalty of their error. Okay? Which is why homosexuality is very directly linked with different types of, obviously, sexually transmitted diseases like AIDS and monkeypox these days and so on and so forth. It is why it has high incidence rates of cancers. It's why it has all manner of other negative health outcomes that are directly not just correlated but causally linked to the practice of homosexuality. Okay? Is that even the body cannot help but bear the consequences of those things, right? So there is an actual, real physical consequence, which itself demonstrates the unnaturality of it, right? The unnaturalness, to use poor English, okay? It is fundamentally against nature, right? This is why the tiresome, lazy excuse constantly levelled in the age of tyrannical tolerance in which we live about, well, how does this impact you? What does this have to do with you, right? What two people do in the privacy of their own bedroom has no impact on you, right? Apart from the fact that that's just not how civil society works, because it's not how ideology works, it's not how civic values work and morals work, especially in an age of an internet and television where the very same ideologies promoting that are constantly shoved in your face. Apart from the fact that it definitely does impact everyone else. The fundamental reality is that it degrades our very human nature, right? And you see this in no greater example. So what it does is it has implicit and inherent moral communication or value, not value in the positive sense, right? In this case, actually negative value, on other things. So like, for example, to declare that two men walking an aisle and exchanging rings and kissing and thereby being declared married is the same thing as your mother and father, my mother and father, your marriage, etc., is to therefore say that the actual inherent natures of you and your wife, or vice versa, you and your husband, is the same exact philosophical dynamic that exists between those two guys, which it's not. It's to also state that the same love, quote unquote, real or otherwise, that is shared between those two men is the same as what you have with your spouse. Which again, back to my point earlier about autophilia, it's not, right? It's the same fundamental reason that underlies or underpins the issue of transvestites, right, of transgenderism as an ideology, okay? That a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man, or to use their more specific parlance, that a man can be born in the wrong body, that a woman can be born in the wrong body, a profoundly Gnostic idea if there ever was one. In that the 6 foot tall bearded guy in a dress being declared to be a woman, and more importantly the demand that I have to refer to that man as she or her or ma'am, is to enforce that I must declare metaphysically that that thing, that person, that creature is the same thing as my beloved mother. Do you understand? Your wife, you're this. The 4 of you. It's 5 of you, sorry. The 5 of you. Right? And vice versa. Right? And it's not. It inherently, the admission to that inherently degrades your own nature. And it would work in the reverse for Danny and I. Right? You get the picture. Right? For the woman claiming to be a man. Okay? All of this has direct philosophical implication upon who every one of us are. Okay, so this is not just this ridiculous, as I said, lazy and utterly pathetic concept of it just, it has nothing to do with you, it has no impact on you. Dullards and simpletons think like that, right? For anyone who uses the thing in their head called their brain to actually think through more seriously and in an adult form the implications, will come to realize that no, it actually says something very profound, and in this case disturbingly so, about the nature of who we are, right? These issues are deeply, deeply impactful on who is a man, who is a woman, what is our purpose, right? But even before you get to the purpose, the meaning, the value, the ontological issue, the ontological issue of who are we is directly fractured and degraded through these practices, okay? Which is why the first description that's given in verse 26 is not evil, sinful, wicked, although those will be terms that will be used later on. The wording, the first description that's given, which is the foundational description, is unnatural. Okay? It is against the lex divina, the divine law, so the moral commands of God, but that he gets to secondarily, not in terms of importance, just in terms of order. Right? It's not that it's evil in a secondary, in a sense of secondary importance. He's not talking in terms of which one is more important than the other. He's talking about which one builds on the other, right? So it builds, the evil aspect builds upon the fact that it's unnatural, okay? That, philosophically, and this is the last point to make on this specific portion, is actually something that's extremely important for Christians to understand, because we do have, and it's not really anyone's fault, because if we're not educated in that way, or if we're not taught that way, then naturally we're not going to have that in our repertoire, right? So I don't blame people. The concept, not even the concept, the reality of something being unnatural is itself sinful, okay? I'll say that again. Something being unnatural is itself sinful, okay? How do we know this biblically? Because actually, by the way, we know this beyond the scriptures. We know this just through the natural observation of the world, pardon the pun. But how do we know this naturally? Okay, let's break this down in terms of how Christians have understood this, right? What is the first time in Scripture wherein the Ten Commandments are given? That's not a rhetorical question. When is the first time the Ten Commandments are given? When Moses went up the mountain. Right, at Sinai, right? Okay, at Sinai, right? He comes down, finds the people doing the rebellion, smashes the tablets, renews the covenant again. They're redrawn on the thing, blah, blah. And then, of course, in Deuteronomy 40 years later, right? But yes, Sinai. Okay, so we're talking 3,500 years ago, roughly, right? There's the entire book of Genesis covering thousands of years before that, which is all before Sinai. Right. Was murder wrong in the days of Noah? Yes. Adultery, lying, covetousness, yes. Idolatry, okay. But the Ten Commandments haven't been given. So how is this functioning? For thousands of years, how is this functioning? Where 10 specific written commandments and the laws that all then come from that, obviously, have not yet been, in this case, literally etched in stone. Because of the natural law, right? The first murder, and in fact, one of the first sin, in fact, really the first sin outside of the garden, at least that's described, is, of course, what? Cain and Abel. Okay? No Sinai, no tablets, no Ten Commandments in terms of writing, none of it. Cain knew it was evil. Abel knew it was evil and it was happening to him. Adam and Eve knew it was evil. The rest of the family knew it was evil. Everyone knew it was evil. With no why? Because what do we have? Life and conscience. Right? We have a conscience. And God has given us life. Who gives life? God. Who can take life? God. Can Cain take life? No. Why? Because Cain's not God. So you can't just murder your brother because you are ticked off that God accepted his sacrifice over your lazy one. Okay? That's a bit cheap on Cain's part because it wasn't just laziness, it was actually something more important. But anyway, for time I'm calling it lazy. Right? It wasn't an issue of laziness, it was an issue of, well, it's complex, but anyway. It was an issue of attitude. But by the way, Cain knows it's wrong. Okay, right. When Mesopotamian man is building the Tower of Babel to make their name great in the heavens, ergo they're building this giant tower, right? And again, there's very deep things going on there. The tower would have been a ziggurat based on that time period of history, which is kind of a Babylonian form of temple. It's also the kind of place where the kings would consummate later on in history at least, consummate their coronation with one of the temple prostitutes, and they would become the embodiment of Marduk, the national god of Babylon, right? So there's this literal place high up in the tower where they become a god, right? The links to Babel are pretty obvious there. They all knew that was wrong. The attempt to overthrow God, the attempt to reach up to the heavens and make their name great, right? To make a name for themselves is the way that the phraseology goes in chapter 11 of Genesis. No Ten Commandments, right? The adulteries that occur, right? Like, for example, with Abraham rushedly sleeping even on his wife's advice with Hagar, right? To try and immunitize the promise, as it were, right? No Ten Commandments. Okay, so how is this all the case? It's also part of the reason why the Ten Commandments are the Ten Commandments, because all 10 of those commandments are all found in Genesis, in terms of things that take place. They've already been broken. Yeah, correct. Yeah, right. All 10 of those commandments, not in tablet written form like that as a law, right? But all of those things we actually find in Genesis in one form or another, directly or indirectly, right? Because they are violating the natural law, right? Law meaning order, the governance, the way that God has designed the world to work. God has designed the world to work that human beings have a life and we don't just slit each other's throats, right? That's how God has designed the world to work. He has permission to take life, so to give life and to take life. You don't have permission to just give life, that would be rape. You don't have permission to take life, that would be murder, right? Only when God has given justification for the giving or taking of life, the giving, holy matrimony, marriage, the taking, justice, right? For he who sheds the blood of man by man shall his blood be shed, Genesis 9, right? The death penalty for murder, okay, is when God gives authority to take life, right? You get the picture. So when I say this, and talking about the natural law, to violate the natural law is sinful. To go against the law, i.e. the order of the way that God has created and designed the world to work, is evil. The laws, the lex divina, the written divine law, right, the moral code of God, the moral law of God, is but the written explanation, an explication in this case, of that. Does that make sense? So they're two sides of the same coin. The natural law, the divine law. Okay, they go hand in hand. They're not the exact same, they're not the same thing, but they go hand in hand. Right? Just like nature and scripture go together. Right? We've explained here, even in this passage going back to the last lesson, right? Verse 19 of Romans 1, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so that mankind is without excuse. Okay? It's why, of course, the psalmist can say that the heavens declare the glory of God. Right? They're the work of your hands. They declare, right? Day by day they pour forth speech. Night by night they declare your glories. Right? The sun, the moon, the stars, the land, the waters, us, the creatures, the animal kingdom, all of it communicates this attribute, that truth, this reality about who God is, what God has done, so on and so forth. Right? All of these things. That's the natural. Right? This is the specific or the special. It's written. It's in written form. So it's the unwritten revelation of God, the written revelation of God, if you want to think of it that way, which is exactly the dynamic between the natural law and the divine law, or the moral law, specifically. Right? Unwritten and written, both equally true, both in conformity with each other, both in parallel working together. Right? That is the fundamental essence of why it's being described as unnatural, ergo evil. So that's why he first describes this as unnatural, and then secondarily describes it as evil. Right? It's evil because it's unnatural. And they receive the due penalty for the error in their own persons, which is the ending of verse 27, right? So moving on to the final portion of verse 28. Okay? And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, here's the third and final one of these references, God gave them over to an unfit mind. Okay? So we've seen off already, verse 24, God gave them over to the lusts of their heart in impurity. Okay? God gave them over to dishonourable passions, verse 26. And now thirdly and finally, God gave them over to an unfit mind, or an unsound mind. There's various different ways that we can kind of essentially bring that into English, right? But an unfit mind, or an unsound mind, right? A degraded mind. That's why it's being described as unfit. Okay, it's not fit for purpose, so to speak. It's not fit for the purpose with which it was designed, right? And for which it was designed in this case. Okay? They did not see fit to acknowledge God. In other words, they rejected God. Right? They turned against him. They rebelled against him. They have turned away and made themselves and their own beliefs and their own ideologies and their own practices the arbiter of what is good and evil in their life, right? They want to live life their own way. Well, then God has given them over to an unfit mind to do those things which are not proper. Okay? So even the usage of the word proper there, again, a couple of different ways you can bring in English, but not proper, not natural, not right, same thing. Which are not proper. They're not fitting. They're not in conformity to what mankind has been designed to do. Okay? And then lists the consequences of this. Okay? Which of course fills out the rest of certainly the next couple of verses. Having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil. So he's using synonymous terms there. Right? Being full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. So filled up with these things, filled up with envy, right? Obviously what that's talking through. Murder, strife, deceit, so deception, lies, malice, maliciousness, tied very heavily to the envy aspect, of course. They are gossips. Right? Your English translation might say something else, but generally speaking, we would render that as they are. It's actually a description of who they are now. It's a description of being, right? So I want you to notice something here. It's not even just simply an explanation of things that they are filled with, like unrighteousness and wickedness and greed and evil, right? It's not only the things that they do, or that they are full of, in this case, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. He then transitions to descriptions, right? So there's no literal wording in the Greek of they are, but the implication in English is they are, okay? There's just a description of, a change in description. He then now using effectively descriptive terms that are functioning as nouns, right? Gossips, slanderers, haters of God, or your translation might say revilers, right? It literally means hateful toward God, right? Haters of God. Violent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. So again, this just shows you, by the way, by the way, I mentioned in passing yesterday about the parts of the Ten Commandments that we today in our nation mostly don't enforce at all, and then the ones that we do, we very selectively enforce. Like murder, for example, and other sorts of things, we don't enforce at all the fifth commandment. There's no way, the fifth commandment's not enforced anywhere publicly, right? In this case, being disobedient to parents is listed alongside violence, slandering, envy, murder, wickedness, greed, and evil. Because and we went through this, by the way, if you ever wanted to refresh yourself, you go back and watch, I suppose, but we went through this when we were back in Deuteronomy chapter 5, obviously, in our sermon series, right, on Sundays, and we went through week by week, all 10 of the commandments, right, the 10 commandments across 10 weeks. And we obviously covered the fifth commandment, and the fundamental point that was explained there, to remind you, is that honour your father and mother is not only limited to the two individual human beings who happen to procreate you, okay? It's a reference to your ancestors, right? Which obviously includes your mother and your father, your literal mother and father, right? But it's not just them. It's your mother and your father, and the mother and father of your mother and father, and the mother and father of your mother and father of your mother, which is why constantly the reference to our fathers, our father Abraham, even Stephen made that reference, right? When he was referring back to his ancestors, our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to God, right? So one of the key central points there as to why the fifth commandment is for starters, part of the 10 commandments, why it's actually the beginning of the second table of the law, right? Loving your neighbour, which is what that's building upon, is because to dishonour your own parents is to dishonour all those who came before them. And to dishonour all those who came before them, who are part of the covenant, because of course this is in the context of the covenant, right? We ourselves here thousands of years later are descended from lines of Christians going back thousands of years, right? In a country like Australia, I'm speaking in general terms. To dishonour our ancestors, therefore, is to dishonour the God of our ancestors, right? Who has guided our people, protected our people, defended our people, loved our people, right? And there is an entire bloodline from all the way back, from father to son, mother to daughter, son to third, forget the picture, parent to child, all the way down to you. All the provision, all the compassion, all the love, all the protection from God through times of hardship and trial and pestilence and plague and drought and warfare. And your line managed to survive. Because plenty who have not, right? In fact, statistically speaking, just based on mathematics, I won't bore you with how this has worked out. But just mathematically speaking, in terms of how genealogy works, most people, in the case of men, most men who have ever lived have not had sons that have survived, have had children who have survived. Okay, statistically speaking, right? Only about 40%, right? For women, it's about 60%. Okay, so most people who have ever lived have not, if you average that across, only half of mankind that has ever lived has ever actually managed to have children who have lived down to today. Okay, they have died at some point. It could have been 1,000 years ago, it could have been 500 years ago, it could have been 5 minutes ago. It doesn't matter, right? So the point I'm drawing here is that the dishonouring of one's parents, including, again, it's not just limited to your mother and father, but it's your ancestors, is to disgrace all that God has done for your people. Right? It's an affront against God. Just like murder, which we think of as isolated between me murdering some other person, is actually destroying, in this case murdering, the image of God in that person, a person whom God breathed life into, who he imparted spirit into, whom he fashioned and knitted together, to use the poetic language of King David in the Psalms, in his or her mother's womb. You get the picture, right? All of that, okay? In this case, the last thing he lists in that description of people is disobedient to parents, right? It's no less serious than anything else that's listed. And so he therefore concludes in verse 31 that they are therefore without understanding, they are untrustworthy, they are unloving, they are unmerciful. There's a very interesting way that he's using that. I want to kind of dial in on verse 31 there at least. Without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. Okay? By virtue of, when he says understanding, he's using the term, again, you understand that biblically speaking, understanding and knowledge are held as two sides of the same coin. Right? So understanding brings about wisdom, right? Or knowledge brings about wisdom. Okay? We see that, for example, in the Proverbs over and over again, right? It's why you have famous proverbs like the beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord, right? That's also using the same phrase to describe wisdom, right? It's why also then God would elsewhere say that my people perish for a lack of knowledge, i.e. understanding, okay? Knowledge and wisdom, right? Because they are removed from God, in this case by having to use all the conjunction of phrases, followed the lusts of their hearts into impurity, have had dishonourable passions, have had an unfit mind, so on and so forth. They did not see fit to acknowledge God. Same phrase, acknowledge, right? They've been given over to those things. That is what happens to mankind, right? When he pursues the unnatural, i.e. the evil, okay? They therefore have no understanding. They are without true understanding. It doesn't mean that they know nothing. That's not what's being meant in this kind of sense, right? You've got to remember, this is coming downstream from one of the operative foundational statements in verse 25. They have exchanged the truth of God for the lie. Okay? Their life is built on a lie. Well, many lies, but the most fundamental lie, which is the worship of the creation, the creature over the creator. Okay? In one form or another. Right? Organised religion, atheism, it's all on the same spectrum, like we discussed in the last lesson. Therefore, they are without understanding. They do not possess the true knowledge of God. They've abandoned it. They've exchanged it. They've exchanged it for a lie. Okay? And consequently, they are then being declared here to be untrustworthy. Okay? And unloving and unmerciful. But at least to dial in the untrustworthy part, right, before the others. This is something which I've talked about before, especially when it comes to historical things or tying in things of that nature. I've explained before, and it's deeply impactful here, in fact it's directly relevant here, that, and it is the reason why I talk so often and harp on so often, relatively speaking, about the Enlightenment. And the culture and the civilization that it's created for us in the last 300 years that we are now living in today, is that the fundamental sin, the cardinal sin, the foundational sin of the Enlightenment was first the subjugation of divine revelation to human reason. Okay? So human reason trumped divine revelation. They didn't abandon divine revelation, not at first. Okay? So I'm talking, 1600s here. Okay? But divine revelation was interpreted in, through, and by human reason. That's why I say subjugated. Okay? Divine revelation, the truth of God in nature, the truth of God in Scripture, et al., was subject to human reason, human systems, human ideologies, human mechanisms or frameworks of reason. Okay? The Enlightenment philosophers themselves disagreeing as to how that actually functioned in the first place, hence why you end up with multiple different schools of interpretation of in terms of epistemology. How do we know what we know?
Was that dispensing with faith to do that?
How do you mean?
Well, they weren't relying on faith in God to have the answers. They were trying to find the answers in human reasoning.
If described like that, yes, sure. If I understand what you mean, then yeah, I would say so. Yes, yes. So, yes. So one of the first things that drops off among serious Enlightenment philosophers of the 1600s is almost anything miraculous, for example. So the supernatural. Okay. So you get into the 18th century, the 1700s. You get famous examples like well, different ones I could pick, I suppose. But say, for example, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the American founding fathers, right? A man himself very intellectual, very smart, and deeply steeped in the Enlightenment in his own right. He had his own personal version, which later on retroactively was called the Jefferson Bible, where anything miraculous in the Bible he had quite literally cut out of the pages. Okay, because the concept of the miraculous, of the supernatural, or whichever term you want to use, right? Jesus walking on water, the healing of the sick and the blind, you get the picture. Anything like that was laughable and ludicrous to someone who has who adhered to the Enlightenment, the concepts of the Enlightenment. Okay, because human reason, once it has subjugated divine revelation, naturally led these men to conclude, at least in the first sense, that if I throw a ball up in the air, it comes down. It doesn't just hover in midair. Which means that the idea of, in this silly example, a ball hovering in midair can't happen. It's impossible. Because when I throw it up in the air, it comes down. Totally and utterly ignoring the fact that a ball comes down when I throw it up, but if God decides to do something different, there's no reason whatsoever, logically or philosophically, as to why God cannot do that, right? If God can create the entire subatomic structure of the universe, he can keep a ball in the air. Okay. Difficulty levels, one is infinitely simpler than another. Okay? So philosophically, there is no philosophical problem for the Christian with miracles. It's just simply a matter of orders or magnitude, what we say magnitudes of power, right? But not to the Enlightenment geniuses. Okay? So once divine revelation had been subjugated to human reason, the next step became very, very simple, which was divorcing divine revelation from human reason, so that the only thing left is human reason. And that's fundamentally and essentially the birth of modern secular humanism. It's the birth of atheism. Okay? So it's why the modern atheist demands evidence and proof for God, and you hand them this, and they say that doesn't count. Okay? Right? You then point to things in nature, but by invoking God, they say that doesn't count. Right? Because you've divorced, that's what I'm saying to you, the consequences of subjugating divine revelation to human reason was the ultimate divorcing of divine revelation from human reason. That's what has found, and everything that has ever come about in the last 300 years is directly downstream in 1,000 different ways from that. Does that make sense? Okay. And you can apply this inside of about 5 minutes to almost any issue you ever want to think of, right? Why is it that we live in a time where people do seriously, genuinely, with a straight face tell you that, of course, the man can become a woman and a woman become a man, going back to the issue we were talking about earlier? Well, because you've done away, i.e. divorced, divine revelation from human reason. The only problem is that human reason, as we're seeing through this passage, is enslaved to sin. It's corrupt. Right. That human reason follows the lusts of its heart in impurity. That human reason follows dishonourable passions. That human that human reason is, in this most literal and third and final sense in verse 28, being directly called an unfit mind. Right? So that's why he concludes it by saying that they are without knowledge, in other words, unknowledgeable or without understanding, and untrustworthy. Now, he's saying untrustworthy for quite a particular reason. He doesn't mean that the rebellious mankind outside of God only ever lies kind of like an anti-Pinocchio, right? It's not as if everything he ever says is always false at all times, like it were an opposite day, right? And so he walks out in the morning and says, beautiful evening, and then goes along his day and he's having a totally fine day, and someone says, how are you? And he says, it's the worst day of my life. That's not what's being meant here. What's being meant, in a much more serious sense, is that by virtue, in his own rebellion against God, in his detachment from the source of life and of truth, and therefore of reason, true logic, and if we want to get very deep philosophical, true logic, right? Keeping in mind the word logic comes from the Greek logos, which you're familiar with, the word of God, okay? That all that is rational, all that is reasonable, all that is logical is found in God, not in man, right? Man is logical and reasonable and rational when he is in conformity with that natural law, right? But getting back to the point, because man, in his rebellious nature and state, outside of God, is therefore detached from that, his reasoning, his rationale, his logic is untrustworthy. It doesn't mean it's always 100% wrong, right? The atheist can accurately and correctly articulate that 1 + 1 = 2. Ta-da. Okay? It's not about frequency. It's about the overall assessment or the state of that thing. Overall, the ungodly man is untrustworthy. If he can look outside at the natural world, if he can look at the greatness of man and of woman, if he can look, especially these days, at the infinitesimal complexity of the human body, down to the genetic level, to the cellular level, even to the atomic level, all of these things, at the most microscopic of scales, all the way up to the most macroscopic of scales, and of the galaxy, and look at all of that, and then turn around and type on Facebook, "Oh, you believe in God. Oh, that's dumb." You're a fool. The entire it's it's taking the mickey, but without being smart, it needs to have the mickey taken out of it. It needs to be mocked. Because, not as an insult, but because it is such just a blindingly foolish conclusion. How can you possibly trust in the general sense, not in a specific sense, talking in the general sense, how can you trust that person ultimately? You can't. You just can't, right? You cannot do it. Because all they have left, by the way, as would any of us outside of God, so it's not an us and a them thing, right? As would any of us outside of God. All that person has outside of God is the finite limitations of their own mortal, rational will, which itself, the reason, right, human reason, is enslaved to sin. This is precisely why, among many other things, we used to have laws in the books in Western cultures, where to hold public office, you had to be a Christian. Okay, this was a Christian nation, as was America, as was Canada, New Zealand, the UK, European nations, right? For two major reasons. One, the man who refuses to submit to God, and this is the other part of the untrustworthiness as well. If someone refuses to submit to God, what are they inherently declaring? They are inherently declaring, whether they intend to or not, it's irrelevant. They are inherently declaring that they are the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. They are the ultimate arbiter of good and evil, of truth and lies. I'm going to live life my way. I'm going to live life according to my own rules. Now, my own rules might be this religion or that religion, right? But even then, what is that saying or determining? Well, it's that person's own self-analysis of which religion they want to choose. So it still comes back to the self either way, right? But in our case today, that's not so much the case. In our case today, it's irreligiosity, right? It's lack of religion. It's agnosticism, atheism, and even then, in the most egregious of forms. Because today, the average person is not like a die-hard, dyed-in-the-wool, like ideologically committed atheist who has sophisticated or seemingly sophisticated arguments for their atheistic perspective, who has studied philosophy and done... No, not at all. The average person, God bless their heart, just living a normal life and working a job at a cafe and doing this, whatever else, just simply flies by the seat of their pants and just lives life on a day-to-day basis, just doing whatever. Like, it's the most unsophisticated form, right? Because at least the ideologically devout atheist has at least put in some semblance of effort to construct their own palace of atheism in their head, right? Do you know what I'm saying to you? There's at least some effort that's been put into coming up with ideas, as incorrect and bad as they often are, right? But for the average person, unfortunately, and again, it's a tragic reality that we bemoan. We don't celebrate it at all. But the tragic reality is that the average person merely meanders through life on autopilot, functionally, sleepwalking through life, with just not caring about any of it. They just don't care. They don't care about this, they don't care about that. They care about paying the bills, keeping their nose above water, and watching the footy game on a Friday night. Like, that's the summation of what's cared about, right?
They're atheists by default in a way.
They live as atheists. They're functional atheists, right? They live as if God doesn't exist and there's no consequence really in the world at all for any of these things. There's no inherent meaning other than vague aspirations of what you ascribe to yourself, meaningfully or otherwise. Right, of course, until life walks up and punches us in the face. Yes, correct. Until life gets serious and then something tragic happens. And this is not, again, I'm not saying this in a mocking sense, but I'm trying to say this to point this out as a genuine point. And then like a tragic death happens in the family or something, right? Something out of the blue. It's a car crash. It's a whatever, something, right? Something unexpected is what I mean. And then it all of a sudden becomes, oh, where was God? What do you mean? What are you talking about? You haven't given a tinker's cuss about this for the last 30-something years of your life. What do you mean? How are you now turning around? How are you now? And again, that only adds to the tragedy, because they're in the midst of tragedy, and then your decision is to double down on the judgment, right? Because instead of actually taking this as an opportunity to maybe reflect and reanalyze what you think about this world and life and your place in it and all these kinds of things, which of course that would be a perfect opportunity to do, you instead kind of just do this to the heavens. Like, what are you doing? That's what this is. And this is the final layer of trustworthiness, by the way, here, because that's the second one. This is the third and final one. Many great minds throughout history have phrased this in one way or another, right? At least the way I learnt it when I was young. Would be that a man who cannot rule himself is unfit to rule any other. Right? A man who cannot rule himself is unfit to rule others. That would be a fundamental, basic principle of leadership that Christians and non-Christians, quite frankly, have espoused in many different ways and forms, as I said earlier. If you don't have any meaningful sense of self-discipline, of soundness of mind, which is what this is used. So like when you see, by the way, in Scripture, when you see unfit mind, unsound mind, lacking in discipline, these are all synonymous terms in the Scriptures. They're all used interchangeably, right? So being of sound mind and self-disciplined are two different phrases that are used interchangeably in the New Testament, for example, especially in the pastoral epistles. If you can't face temptation, again, I'm not talking about moral perfection. I'm talking about the consistent pattern of life here, right? Obviously, if you can't face this problem, this temptation, this issue, and overcome that on a consistent basis, in other words, self-discipline, self-governance, self-rule, you're unfit to rule others. Right? You're unfit to govern others. You're unfit to discipline others. You get the picture. Okay? This is why one of the fundamental command, what is an essence, I suppose? One of the fundamental commands for the criterion, the qualifications for the clergy of the church is, among other things, sound mind, right? Disciplined. Okay? Not being dragged about by every different doctrine, every wind of doctrine, to use a phrase from elsewhere, I think it's 2 Thessalonians. Right? In this case, how am I connecting this to this? Well, quite directly. The man who is in rebellion to God, or the person in general, man or woman, right, who is in rebellion against God, has made them a law unto themselves, right? They are the ultimate arbiter of what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. They act in accord with their own desires, which is of course the exact descriptions being given. The lusts of their hearts to impurity, verse 24, dishonourable passions, verse 26, and being of unfit mind, verse 28, right, to do things which are not proper. Okay? All these kinds of things. These are all descriptions of exactly what I'm talking about. God is not the ultimate moral arbiter. He is not the one whom they are subservient to. There is no greater, higher authority above them other than their own desires, ultimately. Okay? Ergo, what possible trust in the general ultimate sense is there that this person will not betray you, that this person will not be disloyal, that this person will not stab you in the back, that this person will do the right thing at the right time, that this person will choose the difficult right over the easy wrong, so to speak. You get the picture. Right? All these things. Untrustworthy. Right? In our military, to use a parallel example of this, at the highest levels of soldiering, right, special operations, special forces, you go through multiple courses. You go through an assessment to then get onto a pre-selection course. If you pass the pre-selection course, you then get onto the real course, right? So there's multiple layers of filtration to weed out the wannabes and the otherwise useless people. And the guys that eventually get on there and are slaughtered for 3 weeks straight before then having, if they even pass that, to complete 18 months of what's called a reinforcement cycle. In other words, a whole other battery of tests that go for another year and a half. By the time they've done all of this, it's a 2-year process, right, to get to the highest, most consequential levels of warfare. If you have an injury, right, because the injury rate is, in some cases, almost 100% from minor to major, right? It could be a concussion, it could be snapping your femur, it could be a variety of things, right? Because these courses are very, very serious. You can, of course, obviously you're then not going to complete the course. You can then go away, heal up, and if you, again, pass those pre-selections, you can come back and try again, right? The one thing that will never, ever bring you back onto that course, in fact, you will be barred for life from ever attempting it ever again, there's only one thing, and that is if you quit. If you're on that course, that selection, and you quit, you withdraw at own request, which is not just simply like a momentary, oh, I quit, and you say it out loud once. They actually stand there, they make you fill out an entire government bureaucratic form, right? So you're really going through with it, and then that's you quitting. You will never be allowed to attempt it again, because their fundamental philosophy, which is totally, I agree with it 100%, is that if this guy is going to quit on a selection course here in Australia, we cannot trust him to not quit on the battlefield. Does that make sense? He could be an absolute physical stud, Olympic level athletes, because some of these guys really are, like they're extremely athletic, right? Incredible run times, lifting numbers, his strength, this and that, shoot the daylights out of things, like incredible tactical mind. He could be really smart, all these things. It doesn't matter. This guy could be the perfect candidate for special operations, and it doesn't matter, because if that dude quits, he is a quitter. Do you understand? So that's why part of these descriptions, again in verse 30, we often in English will say, of course, at the end of verse 29, beginning of verse 30, the wording is not there in the Greek to say they are or they have become, but we usually render it that time. At times in certain translations, we put that in English to make it clear what's being said. Gossips, slanderers, haters of God, violent, arrogant, boastful, etc., etc. They are those things. There's no magically just separating sin from the person. I know we have this phrase in kind of modern evangelical church circles of love the sinner, hate the sin, and I get the impetus behind that, and I don't even necessarily agree, at least if I try and frame it in the best possible light. But it's not like we as human beings are inherently good and then we're beset by this exterior force called sin, and you can just magically separate the sin and the sinner. No, you can't. Only God can separate the sin and the sinner. That's what happens through redemption. We are cleansed of our unrighteousness by the grace of God through faith. It's why God says that baptism now saves you, because we are cleansed not by water in the body, but we're cleansed spiritually in 1 Peter chapter 3. Right? We are given faith. Our unrighteousness is cleansed. Our record of debt, to use the terminology from elsewhere in Paul and others, is removed. Right? We are made pure and righteous in God's sight, and we are given Christ's righteousness on account to us, right? Etc., etc., etc. You get the picture, okay? Only God can remove sin, the stain of sin, the curse of sin, the record of sin from man. Outside of that, they're one and the same. You are that thing, right? Someone commits one murder, goes to prison, they're a murderer. Like, obviously, right? You are that thing, okay? That's why I use that parallel example. You are a quitter. Well, he only quit once. Yeah, and thereby became a quitter. And for the rest of his military career, can they trust him to be not a quitter? Well, no, not anymore. He may never quit ever again. But you don't have time to worry in the middle of a gunfight on a battlefield as to whether the guy standing right next to you, who's making sure that you don't get shot in the head from that direction, is going to quit. Okay, untrustworthy. This is the point that's being drawn here. If you are a slave to your own vices, to your own passions, to your own lusts of your own heart, you're untrustworthy. You cannot ultimately be trusted to consistently do the right thing. You cannot ultimately be trusted to do what is honourable, to fulfil duty, to be loyal. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to morality, you're loyal to nothing but yourself and your own opinions and your own beliefs and your own desires. There's no higher authority above you. What accountability is there? It's why we suffer and languish today politically. Because what accountability do any of these people in their own heads have above themselves? Nothing. Nothing. None of the politicians, none of the bankers, none of the corporations, and more importantly, or at least equally as importantly, none of the average punter just living life here in Australia has any authority higher than himself. Other than things that would cause discord. But that's not an authority above, that's a parallel authority, right? If I think this is going to cause a problem, right, in my family, or if I think this is going to cause a problem in my workplace, or if I think this is going to cause a problem with my wife or my husband, if I think this is going to cause whatever the scenario is, you get the picture, right? That's a parallel authority. It's on the same level as you. Does that make sense? It's not above you. There's no objective sense, right? And so if you're someone who thinks you can get away with it, and you're inclined to do so, well then today you do it.
Which is what every criminal does.
Which is what every single criminal who's ever lived does. Yes, exactly right. Coming in. Which is what every, you're right, exactly what every criminal that's ever lived does, right? I've explained this before about Jeffrey Dahmer, right? The worst serial killer in American history, right? Back in the 70s and 80s, eventually caught in 89 or 90 or somewhere in there, right? I've talked about how the fact that he converted in prison, blah, blah, blah. I've talked about this before. This and that. And when after his conversion, he explained, when he was asked, why did you do all these things? Why did you kill and cannibalize dozens of men? Well, because I was an atheist and I could. What is going to stop me? It doesn't mean every atheist does that. That's the point I made back then. But why not, though? Because it's not about what limitation do you have. The answer is nothing, other than what you think you can get away with, which is exactly what Dharma's point was. If I can outsmart the cops, which he did for almost 20 years, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Nothing. Right? Because there's no higher accountable authority. Right? That's why he mentions untrustworthy there. For all three of those major reasons. Untrustworthiness. They are unloving and they are unmerciful. Unloving. Why does he say unloving? Well, it's odd because, of course, like if you ask just your average, like we were talking about earlier, your average punter, do they love their wife, do they love their husband, whatever direction it is? Yes. Do they love their children? Yes. Right? So again, this is why I've said these are not. When we say total, and this is coming back to the conclusionary point about what we began with about total depravity in the Christian terminology. Total does not mean that every single thing that they do at every waking moment is this or that. That's not what's being meant by total. Total is not describing the frequency. It's describing the scope. Right? In other words, what we might say is it's not describing scale, which would be everything that's ever done at every waking moment. It's describing the scope. Does sin and corruption and wickedness and all these things have been described here, right? The lust of the heart and impurity. Does it only touch this portion of their life and the rest is all very perfectly good and righteous and noble and honourable and pure? Or is it all of it? And the answer is it's all of it. Right? The answer is it's all of it. Which is why we can then have scenarios where you, as we do now, have mass divorce rates. For example, right? And again, there's differing reasons as to why divorces happen. There's complex reasons, there's trite reasons, but generally speaking, the reasons are not complex. There are complex reasons as to why that can at times happen. But I'm speaking in generalities here, right? Not specifics, okay? In a general sense, the reasons are trite, okay? The single most common reason that is ever listed is irreconcilable differences today, okay? Through no-fault divorce, which again itself is also playing on this very problem we were describing earlier about lack of accountability. That you can have two people who make an oath and sign legal government documents, yet neither party can somehow ever be at fault. Well, someone's got to be at fault, even if it's both people being at fault, or if it's one person being at fault. It can't be a scenario where neither party is at fault. Right? Why am I saying all that? And again, that's the general side of things. There are specific, more complexities. I'm not talking about those things. Here he's describing as unloving because the love that may genuinely well be there is itself disconnected from the source of love. It's the same problem and dynamic that we were describing earlier about human reason, right? The lifelong atheist can obviously state basic truths and explain even serious concepts. They can be intellectually brilliant in terms of like IQ. They can have degrees. They can be lifelong practitioners in this field or that field, blah, blah, scholars or whatever. That's not the purview of what's being discussed. The purview of what was being discussed in that is that if their reason, their human reason, is the ultimate source, or even in many cases just the only source of understanding and knowledge, it's detached from divine revelation, it's detached from the source of truth, it's detached from the source of knowledge. It itself is therefore futile because that's what it is. It's mortal, limited, confined, and subject to sin. Subject to these passions and other things. That equally applies to these other categories like love. Okay? Much like what we're talking about with untrustworthiness, one can say he has love for his wife and his family and then go off and have an affair and then divorce his wife and run off with the new woman, whatever the case is. So you had love, but that love was limited, finite, and subject to your own passions, exactly the categories we're talking about here. Right? It's not the true state of love. It's not love that is defined ordered and governed by God. The only kind of love that can ever be what we describe as true love, the highest form of love, metaphysically. Right? And then unmerciful. Okay? In this case, unmerciful is also equally an interesting categorization amidst the other two, right? Untrustworthy and unloving, right? They are unmerciful, okay? By virtue of the exact same simple dynamic that I just got done explaining with regard to love. God is mercy. He is therefore merciful. True mercy comes in and through and by God. The one who is cut off from God does not show true mercy. They cannot show true mercy. No? Here's why, specifically. And it cuts in two directions, actually. Very interestingly, it can cut in two seemingly polar opposite directions. So I'll do my best to try and break down what I mean by this. I'm going to use obvious examples just to help us convey the concept, especially for the sake of time. The example of unmerciful in the most obvious of senses would be the brutal and unmerciful barbarism that has been utterly ubiquitous and normal to whichever degree across every single human culture really throughout history, okay? Particularly and especially in the pagan sense, right? The difference between ancient Egypt, ancient Assyria, ancient Babylon, ancient Persia, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome, right? The five, or in this case the six, major empires that really ruled much of the Fertile Crescent in the Eastern Mediterranean world, the ancient Mesopotamian world and beyond, right? Was who was more powerful, more violent, more martially capable, more brutal at that time period. That's essentially it, right? Each one was successively more martially capable, so warfare, more brutal, more barbaric than the next, right? In one degree or another, right? Depending on how you want to analyze it, okay? It was a social Darwinist's dream of the survival of the fittest, of might is right, or might makes right, okay? That he who is most powerful is right, in that sense, right? That's what I'm describing, okay? We conquer you because we can. We take what is yours because we can. We take your women because we can. We take your wealth because we can. Our gods want to defeat your gods, and we will do this to you because we can, okay? So brutal, barbaric, dog eat dog, law of the jungle, all these kinds of phrases and idioms that we could use to describe the same concept, right? You get the picture. That is just the general flow of humanity since our dawn. Okay. It is only, and I do really mean only in the context of Christian civilization, of Christendom, particularly, albeit not exclusively, in Europe, in which that natural impetus, when I say natural, I don't mean according to God's design, I mean according to what's common and frequent. So in this case, technically it's an unnatural thing, metaphysically be the picture. That common impetus of man has only ever been tempered in Christian society. Because now the dynamic that existed between this barbarian Germanic tribe and this barbarian Germanic tribe is that they now actually worshipped the same God, one of them, Jesus Christ, who among other titles is called the Prince of Peace. Okay. So, over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen over time, the commonality and frequency of how often we're killing those guys and taking their stuff goes down and down and down and down. Okay? And often, very often in fact, throughout the history of Europe in the last 2,000 years, the single sole diplomatic reason as to why two nations, two kingdoms did not go to war was because at the end of the day, we're both Christian and we don't want Christians to die here. That's it. Okay? It's the opposite kind of impetus that you saw in other points of the Middle Ages, like with the Islamic onslaughts and the invasions of Europe. Because from their side, it's the old school, kill the infidel, and either you convert or pay us bomb loads of tax, or we'll behead you. Right? It's very simple, right? Because at the end of the day, the teachings of Muhammad, the religion, is fundamentally a military doctrine, infinitely more than it is a religion. So there's that kind of unmerciful, right? No mercy. Kill or be killed. Dog eat dog, law of the jungle, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful takes, to use the description of many of the ancient Greek philosophers, not so much necessarily explaining what they personally believed or didn't believe, but more just describing simply what was, right? The strong take what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Very famous ancient Greek philosophical saying and proverb. Okay? The strong take what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Because at the end of the day, if it's simply strong versus weak, what are you going to do about it? The answer is nothing. So it's why so might does not equal right, right? So might is not right, but might is. What I mean by that is that, and I'm going to say this completely tongue-in-cheek so I don't get too caught up on what I'm saying here, right? In an entirely unadmirable and utterly unimpressive feat of strength, not one of you could defeat me physically. Okay? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, right? We could team up, right? 7v1, right? So, and so I'm saying to it's all tongue-in-cheek. And so there is a sense in which if I was not governed by any authority higher than myself, back to the whole Jeffrey Dahmer explanation, I can do what I want. And that being smart, against almost any man, I can do whatever I want. My height, my strength, my martial arts background, all these kinds of things, I can do what I want. The reason why I do those things is as an honour to God, in that being, I'm not trying to self-gloat here, I'm just trying to explain the dynamic, in being my size, my strength, my fighting abilities, I'm entirely disciplined by God and his law to not do those things. Unless it's in the service of God or of Christians and other people, right? In a defensive thing, right? You get the point. That's that form of unmercifulness. The other kind is the much more subtle, and I actually think personally more pernicious. It's an opinion, right? You can maybe pitch and toss back and forth. I think it's actually much more dishonourable, at least. And what I'm referring to is the actual opposite direction of this spectrum of unmercifulness. And it is what we might otherwise call false mercy or false compassion. Okay? This is actually more of our problem today, not the other one. Well, we actually have both, but anyway. It's the ideologically driven, self-righteous sense of mercy and compassion that actually leads you to do things that are not for human benefit and flourishing. Right? I have lost count by now of how many times I've been told very seriously, very unironically to my face, from a person themselves with a dead straight face, that abortion is merciful, that it is compassionate. Won't you just have compassion? And again, it's all different directions, right? The infinitesimally small amount of examples that get used as the scapegoat, like the woman who was raped, and are you going to force that person to? You're not being compassionate to that woman. You're not being merciful. Of course, utterly failing to just think about 2 steps ahead and answer the question as to why a baby deserves to be killed because his father or her father was a rapist. Right? The answer is, of course, he or she shouldn't be. Why does the baby deserve a death penalty when you wouldn't even give the death penalty to the rapist? You want to throw him in prison and give him 3 square meals and a television and a library. Right? I at least want to do the honourable thing and have him hang in the public square. Right? Why is it that you think that, as I've had again countless times, deformities, Down syndrome diagnosis, this illness or this, that in utero, that it would be cruel to bring that child into the world. So which I've had all the time. So your solution is that you find out that a baby has Down syndrome in the womb, so let's kill it. So feigning to be merciful, they are the most unmerciful. In their alleged self-profession of mercy and compassion, they become cruel. Right? This happens all the time. We do it on the opposite end with euthanasia. Okay? Under the same auspices, right? Of trying to eliminate suffering at the other end. But of course, like we've seen in countries that have been already running this for a number of years, chief among them places like Canada, Belgium, and especially the Netherlands, all you end up with is state-sanctioned death panels deciding affirmatively that yes, of course, this 14-year-old with depression should just die. Right? And so you get 16-year-old girls in the Netherlands who, I'm not trying to be rude, who are 16-year-old girls whose emotions are doing this, right? Totally naturally and normally, by the way, I'm not even saying that negatively, and are suffering from what at any other time we would just call general teen angst and worries and concerns about all the world-altering things in their life, like their friend Stacey having a breakup and something else going on at school and things that teenagers do, right, which is their world to them. And you get one quack psychologist say, oh, no, this is clinical depression. And of course, that gets kicked up the bureaucratic panel. And then the government panel decides, yes, no, this person should be allowed to euthanize themselves. Because your solution is just, oh, you're feeling down in the dumps, kill yourself.
Is that really happening?
Absolutely, categorically, without question, yes. Rampant, yes. Thousands, I think at this point it's actually probably tens of thousands in the Netherlands have gone through that. With that, absolutely, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Assisted suicide.
Yes, the assisted suicide, euthanasia, yes. And it happens in all directions. So it happens with, this happened recently, I think this was it was in Canada. Yeah, it was in Canada, I'm pretty sure this happened war veteran, Afghanistan veteran from Canadian military. If I remember correctly, I don't want to botch the details, but if I remember correctly, like combat, like wounded in action, so lifelong, obviously medical problems. I actually think I remember correctly, amputated leg. Don't quote me on that. Naturally suffering from depression-like symptoms, because obviously PTSD. They approved him for euthanasia. Because so the government's recommendation is, oh, you served your country, you fought, you literally bled for this and for that. Here's the best we're going to offer you. Why don't we help you kill yourself? You know what you should do? Just off yourself. That's how we help our veterans. The unmerciful. This is what this is describing. See, again, we pass by these words when we read scripture, but when you actually pause for a second and think about them very seriously, you realize how deep and profound it is. Every single word's being chosen is meticulous, right? So both of these directions, the kind of the overt barbarism of just pure dog-eat-dog warlordism, unmerciful. The opposite end of the spectrum, of the exact same spectrum, the same scale of unmerciful, is the false compassion, the false mercy, the false love, all these kind of things, that ends up in utter cruelty, absolute mercilessness, and barbarity. The barbarity of killing off undesirable people, depression, medical this, blah, blah, blah. Because, yeah, you're asking, has this been happening? Yeah. The amount of times in the Netherlands, which is the home of this, unfortunately, that 80-something-year-old, and has all the health issues of an 80-something-year-old, as people often do, right? You come along and just think about this dynamic for 5 seconds, for even 5 seconds. You've got this medical problem, medical bills, of course, which go up and up and up and up and up. you're taking 147 pills a day to fix this problem, and then you're taking this problem to fix this problem, and the side effects from this problem, Your family's paying through the nose for drugs, for the medicine, for hospice care, for whatever the scenario is. And you're looking around, and you're already feeling like a burden on your family, which is a natural thing to feel potentially at that time. You shouldn't feel like that, but it's a natural thing to feel. I get why you would. And then along comes the government with their beautiful little compassion project of helping you have a dignified death. They're not telling you to kill yourself. They're not saying that what you should do is you should alleviate your family of this financial burden by ending your existence. But what on earth do you think any person in that scenario, just any normal Joe Schmo, at that late stage of life, with those medical issues, with those medical bills, with those personal care bills, is going to feel toward that? They're being pushed toward it. They don't need it. The government doesn't need to come out and say with these panels, oh, the best thing you can do is just kill yourself. That's not what they're saying to them literally. They're cloaking it in utterly satanic and diabolical language about care and compassion and dying with dignity and all this other insert expletive word. But what are they doing? You're spiritually and emotionally manipulating these people into killing themselves to alleviate the stress on their family, the financial burden, to die with dignity, all this rubbish. You're just leading them to killing themselves, to death. Unmerciful. That's what this is. And it's for, at least in my opinion, again, this is an opinion, right? But in my opinion, that is utterly more contemptuous than anything on the other end. Because there is an honesty to warfare. I get my people, we line up on this side of the field, you get your guys on that side of the field, we've got our swords and shields, you got your swords and shields, and we're going to come slaughter you. It's honest. There's an honesty to violence. There really is, right? Especially someone who's done martial arts. There's a real honesty to violence, right? There's no hiding or cloaking, getting punched in the face, right? There's an honesty to it. It's barbaric, it's brutal, it can be completely grotesque and evil, no doubt, but it's actually at least honest. We're here to kill you and take your stuff. That's it. I know it sounds sincere, but that's it.
There's always wrong.
No, I'm saying. No, but exactly. We raid your village, we burn it to the ground, we take your women, rape them, take the gold, take the jewellery, take the silver. Why? Because we want it. Because we can. It's honest.
So you can always surrender.
Yep, surrender or die. And why are we doing this? Because we can. And we want your stuff and we're going to take it. Evil, but honest. This stuff over here, the other end of the spectrum, there's no honesty. There's no honour. There's nothing. It's actually the opposite. It's people who are the most self-righteous people who think themselves to just be these bastions of compassion and mercy toward the downtrodden, but their compassion and mercy equals them offing the elderly, offing young people who are depressed, who are this, who are that, suffering from this problem, or just offing babies. From the beginning of life to the end of life and everything else in between, it just results in them killing people en masse. That's the mercy, right? That is what I'm talking about when, or that's my point what this is talking about with unmerciful. Right? It cuts both directions, okay? And so then finally, to conclude, verse 32. And although, again, very important verse, and although they know the righteous requirement of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. So he's repeating much of a point that was made, of course, as we referenced earlier, back in verses 18 and 19, right? Suppressing the truth in unrighteousness because that which is known about God is evident within them. That's what he's referring back to, right? They know the righteous requirements of God because we all have a conscience. And without being smart, Christianity has also been around for more than 5 minutes. Okay? So you've got both of those directions, right? But we have a conscience, and especially in our place today, right? This is a nation born of Christian people, built upon Christian foundations very explicitly, so on and so forth, right? So it's the most obvious and manifest, right? But this applies generally, just in general, even beyond that, right? They know the righteous requirements of God. Their conscience testifies against them, as does all of ours, between what is right and wrong. We only do what we want because we suppress that truth in unrighteousness, back to verse 18. That those who practice such things are worthy of death, for indeed the wages of sin is what? Death. Okay? The day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in that day you shall surely die. The consequence of the fall was being exiled from the Garden of Eden. I'm referring all the way back to Genesis 3, right? Cut off from the tree of life, we would now die. Ta-da. Okay? Our immortality taken from us by our own hand as a natural consequence to our inaction, right? We came to a crossroad. More importantly, Adam came to a crossroad. He zigged when he should have zagged, and here we are, right? They know that we know the righteous requirement of God, and that those who practice are worthy of death in the ultimate sense, including even certain types of crimes, i.e. sins, that are worthy of death in themselves. Not all sins are worthy of death in the civic sense, but that's more the subject of Deuteronomy. And they not only do the same, so he actually is expanding on this. It's not even just an individualistic personal thing. They also give hearty approval to that which is done. Please see Mardi Gras of a couple of days ago. Right? That's why we have to have, I'm saying have to, that's why our culture today has to have mass celebrations of the cardinal sin of pride. Okay? And that's why you get this kind of delusion that you can read of. Like, it's not like even just yesterday, the same old story about the woe is me, the downtrodden, oppressed sodomite, right? Of someone going to a Mars. This is just literally an op-ed in I can't remember which rag it was in, maybe Sydney Morning Herald or one of those godless papers, about marching because I remember I was an AFL player. That's right. I think it was an AFL player or a former AFL player, marching because like he remembers back when he was like starting out his career as a rookie at 19, which is probably like 20 years ago or something. And like there was this one gay guy on his team who like couldn't tell others about it and blah blah blah. It's like, that's 20 years ago. You are the most celebrated, protected community on the planet. Every law is geared toward ensuring your promotion. Children are indoctrinated every single year into your ideology. I can go on social media right now and every corporation, every government department, the police, the ADF, the fire brigade, all have your flag on their profile picture. What are you talking about? You are the most protected, celebrated people in the country. Your Pride Parade is the high holy day of our secular calendar. You have an entire month dedicated to you people. What are you on about? But this is the kind of delusion, right? Because this is what happens. It's not just a personal thing. No, they heartily celebrate everyone else that does it, because that's what happens with the culture, because this is what's being described. When you zoom out for this portion really of verses 18 to verse 32, so in other words, this kind of this opening portion of the actual bulk substance of the book of Romans, once we got through the intro for the first 17 verses, what is this second half of chapter 1 saying? That because of the condition of the human heart, or we'd say is the human condition, which apart from God is enslaved to sin, and that curse of sin touches every portion of our lives. That's why in Christian terminology we call it total depravity. I'd like to remind you, it doesn't mean every single thing that every person does at every waking moment is sinful. What it does mean, though, is that every portion of our being is touched by this, including even in the body. The fact that we die is actually part of that, most obviously, right? We decay over time, we get old, and we die. And even in certain sins, again, certain sins have impacts on the body, right? You can't go and get yourself addicted to drugs and then even get off those drugs and not have lingering problems. Of course you'll have lingering problems. There's consequences, right? There's sexual diseases, there's cancers, there's all kinds of things which are associated directly with homosexuality, with sodomy. Blah, 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 you get the picture. All of this is building up to the point that it then becomes culturally ubiquitous. And when people, to remind you of that threefold phrase, are given over by God to that thing, or to those things, I suppose, plural, it then becomes the status. It becomes the normal. And that's where different cultures at different times have been, to one degree or another. It's where we are now. Okay? And it can only end in one of two things, as has always been the case, either a return back to God and the natural law, the divine law, the order, blah, blah, and healing that God does for that, or our own demise, literally destruction. Right? To such a degree, by the way, to leave you with this, that even the ancient pagan Romans, seeing as I referenced them much earlier today, were aware of that. Right? What I'm referring to is in the Republican era. Okay, so the 500 years BC prior to Christ, right? The 500 years of the Roman Republic. Rome's major rival, their arch nemesis, was, of course, the Carthaginian Empire. Okay? Fought three famous wars against them in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, called the Punic Wars. Okay, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Punic Wars. Second Punic War was famous for the great Roman general Hannibal, right? Hannibal Barca, who marched his army and his war elephants over the Alps and ransacked his way through Italy, so on and so forth, blah, blah. When they got to, obviously the Romans won the first and the second wars, and Carthage was now still there, but it was small. It had lost much of its imperial territories by the time we get into the early 100s, so the early 2nd century BC. Rome, many in Rome, especially the senators, wanted to essentially finish off Carthage, right? Because Carthage kept coming at the Romans, right? Cato the Elder, one of the famous figures from Roman history, a senator, was renowned for having come up with a catchphrase, a political slogan during this time. Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Okay, they could be talking about anything. The Senate that day could be talking about grain supplies in Gaul or somewhere else. Right? Well, they hadn't conquered Gaul yet at that point, but they could be talking about grain supplies around the Republic somewhere off in Sicily or wherever else, and he'd give his speech about imports and this and that and economic statistics, blah 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 blah, and then would say Carthago delenda est, and then sit down. Right? They could be talking about anything. And Cato, if he ever gave a speech, I'm sure every other Roman senator, whenever it was Cato's turn to give a speech, kind of went, oh boy, here we go. And waiting for him to eventually talk about whatever, and then finish by reminding them, oh, and by the way, Carthage must be destroyed. Right? It was this constant thing, okay? And became the defining phrase, the motto of the Third Punic War, where Rome conquers and destroys Carthage once and for all. Okay, and effectively burns Carthage to the ground and wipes that civilization off the face of the earth. What the Romans realized, even, I'm saying to you how wild this is, even as pagans themselves, is that a civilization like Carthage, who are descended from the Phoenicians are northern Canaanites. Okay, so we encounter Phoenicians in the Bible, most famously in the form of Jezebel. So Jezebel was a Phoenician, right? So the land that is today basically Lebanon, or much of Lebanon, right? It's a bit more than that, but Lebanon and parts of northern, the state of Israel, that's the ancient Phoenician land. So Tyre, Acca, Sidon, blah, 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 right? It's where Jezebel was a princess of Tyre and Sidon, right? Carthaginians were descended from them, okay? They're Canaanites. So what do you think they do among other things? Well, they sacrifice their children to Moloch. Okay, so Carthage, sacrificed thousands of babies every year to Moloch. Okay, thousands and thousands and thousands of babies every single year. And so even the pagan Romans knew and realized that an entire civilization, that a civilization whose brick and mortar is literally built on the blood of their own children, cannot be allowed to survive. It cannot be allowed to live. They refused to live in a world where that was their rival. And so they destroyed them, right? Even the pagan Romans, right? Now, hypocritically, because the Romans also practiced what the Greeks practiced, which was abortion through what's called exposure, which is basically we have the baby, and then if we think that this baby is too small or too weak, or it has a deformity, or if it has something, we just chuck them out. Yep. Yes, they adopted that from.
If they're a girl.
They could, yeah, more likely to if they were a girl. We cut both directions, but yeah, proportionally speaking, more likely to be a girl. They'd leave them under a bridge, or they'd leave them often in the dumpster out the tip outside of Rome. The Christians were famous for saving those babies from the tips and the bridges of Rome in the first couple of centuries AD. They had that practice adopted from the Greeks, right? Because they themselves are distantly related to the Greeks. The Spartans would famously do that. They would take a baby up onto Mount Taygetos, which is the big mountain next to Sparta, this warrior culture, and they would analyze that baby, and if that baby, especially the boy, was thought to be something off the cliff, right? Because they were a culture that built themselves up as only the fit survive, and every man is a warrior and part of the Spartan army. Anyway, get back to my point. The Romans understood and knew that any culture that has descended to that point is doomed for destruction and cannot. It's not even simply that it should not survive, although it should not survive. It cannot be allowed to survive. And the reason why it cannot be allowed to survive is actually because of a very simple reason. It cannot be allowed to survive because it cannot survive. You can't build a civilization and, more importantly, maintain it throughout the ages when you're perpetually killing off the future. Right?
Sounds like us.
It doesn't sound like us, huh? Go ahead.
Why did they bother with killing them off? Why didn't they just, if they knew that, then why didn't they just let them?
Because they continued to. Good question. For the Romans, it was a good question. Because for the Romans, it was not simply a matter of just letting them kind of fizzle out. For them, it was actually something deeply philosophical, which of course is a very Roman thing, given how philosophically minded they were, like the Greeks. For them, it was a matter of these people. The very existence of a culture that does that is itself an existential threat to us. They are people whose culture is built on death. They will continue to expand, continue to assail against us, what I'm meaning. They will continue to war, and that war machine is powered by the ritual sacrifice of their own children, right? They go to war because they've made sacrifices to Moloch and the other gods that give them the blessing. See what I'm saying to you? So the sacrificing of the children is the engine that powers the war machine of Carthage, right? That engine is not oil and money and this and that. It's human sacrifices. We as Carthage are agreed that we have the blessing of the gods to go to war because we've made the necessary sacrifices to them. In this case, the sacrifices of our children. See what I'm saying to you? So they can chug along with all the impetus to go to war because they've made these sacrifices. So they can't be allowed to exist any longer because they will continue to go to war against us on that blessing. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So yes, that's what ends up happening, and that's why verse 32 finishes the way it does. It's not just some personal individualistic thing that they go, oh, well, I'm going to do it this way, but, no, they give hearty approval. Because of then what does that give? It gives the assent of the mob. Yeah, it's the common conscience, as I like to call it, the common conscience, right? Because if other people are doing it, and we're all collectively approving it together, well, I feel fine in doing it, right? It's one of the unfortunate underpinnings of democracy as a system, in that if the will of the people is bent toward this, well, then the masses collectively agree to vote on this person who will give them what they want. Right. And so that's how you get demagoguery. That's how you get charlatans. That's how you get, you understand what I'm saying too? That's how you get all those things, right? The ancient Greeks recognized that. Others have recognized that. We kind of just obstinately refuse to recognize that. But that's what you get. Because when the system is built on the will of the people, well, what if the will of the people is corrupt?
That's how we got our Prime Minister.
Right. Yes, it's how we've got various different things. Exactly right. It's how we've had how many living prime ministers have we had since 2008, 2009? We went Rudd, who was backstabbed by Gillard, who was then backstabbed again by Rudd, who was then obviously they lost, and then Abbott got in, I think if I remember correctly, and then Abbott got backstabbed by Turnbull got backstabbed by Morrison, and then they lost, and now we've got Old Mate in, until he presumably gets stabbed in the back by someone else at some point. I don't know, it's just why you just chuck his good. It's just this kind of, exactly, because it's just this arbitrary chop, flip, because of how these things go. When you have a culture that ingratiates itself in this way, that's the consequence and the byproduct, right? With the consent of the people who affirm each other. That's why you have all the. That's why it's all. Again, that's why people demand that you do these things. They demand you wear the tranny pin on the thing at work. They demand that you say the pronouns correctly. They demand that you affirm this, and they demand that you respect the welcome to country thing. They demand that you respect the holy month of Ramadan. They demand, it's always because by forcing it on you, it's giving themselves exactly what's being described here, right? They practice those things that are worthy of death. Not only do they do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. The reason why they do that is because by giving hearty approval to others, and in other words, promoting it in others, that person will then promote it back to them. It's a self-enclosed system. It's a loop of approval. If I approve others, that will incentivize them to improve me, to approve me, right? Because we're all on the team, and that's why we have that term today, allies, right? You may not be the LGBT or whatever, but are you an ally? You must be an ally. Because if no one's an ally, well, then it means people disapprove of them, and they don't want people to disapprove of them. So, so you have to be an ally. You have to be an ally, right? They don't demand that you join the cult, but you have to be an ally of the cult, okay? You have to be an ally of this political party. You have to be an ally of insert whatever fleeting movement that popped up last Tuesday, right? That's the problem when you remove from ancient things like this, which don't change, right? Either way, we go on and on about that. But nevertheless, that's it for today. Sin and the enslavement of what the reformers would call the bondage of the will, the enslavement of the sin, the bondage of the human will to sin, the state of the human condition, leads us to lust in our impurity, to follow the impurities of our own heart, the lust of our own heart. It causes us to follow our own dishonourable passions, right, and those desires. And in doing all of that, we do these things like unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, envy, blah, blah. We become full of envy and murder and strife and malice, et al. And we become gossips, slanderers, murderers, haters of God, violent, arrogant, boastful, et al. And when we, as a result of this, and not even as a result of this, but whilst this is going on, God moves any restraint, to remind you of what we spoke about at the beginning, hands us individually, or us a people, either or, both end actually, over to these things. And he removes any restraint as a judgment. You want to head this direction? Then you're going to find out what happens when you head that direction. And I'm not going to do anything to stop the train. It's basically God taking his hand off of the brake. Right? He doesn't need to actively cause it. Well, he doesn't actively cause it anyway. He's not the author of sin. But he doesn't need to actively cause it. He lets mankind find out the natural consequences of his unnatural desires and actions.